All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I hope everybody is doing as well as can be, being as safe as possible, and taking care of their loved ones. While we have all gotten used to Zooming, we all know it's a facsimile of our lives and not a substitute for the real thing of actually being together. I look forward to the day we'll all be back, gathering again in person, and I know that day will come because I know we all can't wait to see each other again, enjoy being together, and experiencing our great city together. Now, it might take a little bit longer than we had hoped, but New York will be back, and I believe stronger, wiser, and better than before. Until that day, I'm happy that ABNY's been at the center of fostering important conversations and dialogues digitally, and I'm grateful to all of you who joined us today. Following the murder of George Floyd, ABNY committed to working with Black leaders across our city so that we can listen and learn how we as a community can come together and help drive positive change. I specifically want to say it was after the murder of George Floyd and the outrage and grief that followed his murder. I want to say that because I recognize that while his passing was the impetus, at the same time, that statement inherently overlooks Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, to name just a few of the far too many who have been killed. And that having this conversation in our ABNY community is both important and overdue. Our intent is that these conversations are a starting point, not the end point. And we hope that it'll inspire concrete steps that we can take both individually and collectively. We're honored to begin these conversations and our series with our public advocate, Jumaane Williams, whose passionate advocacy for New Yorkers has been career-defining. He has been instrumental in reducing discrimination, creating jobs for young people, improving public safety, and addressing affordable housing. Of particular note, while he was a New York City Council member, Jumaane sponsored the Community Safety Act, which ended the NYPD stop, question, and frisk policy. Jumaane helped us all see the light. And thanks to this pivotal legislation, our city became more fair while still remaining the safest big city in America. We last hosted the public advocate in one of our breakfasts in October at the Hilton in Midtown, and that does really feel like a lifetime ago in so many ways. George Floyd's horrific and heartbreaking death did not occur in our city, but as New Yorkers, we must confront the racism and inequality that has been marginalized and killing Black Americans and communities across our country. If you believe in New York and our values as a diverse city that embraces and loves our differences, you believe in this issue, and I'm grateful to the public advocate for his vision and wisdom that he will share with us today. We're a group that takes pride in working for a better New York, and having this conversation and seeing how we can make a positive difference is core to who we are. Over the next few weeks, we'll be hearing from other Black leaders across New York City in politics, activism, government, philanthropy, journalism, labor, and law, including Deputy Mayor Phil Thompson, President of the Ford Foundation Darren Walker, Emmy Award-winning journalist Cheryl Wills, President of 1199 SCIU United Healthcare Workers East, George Gresham, and our New York State Attorney General, Tish James. Our hope is that our community will use these insights from these conversations to take action, working to make our city more just, equitable, and inclusive. I'm grateful to our public advocate and to our moderator for this conversation, Larry Scott Blackman, Fresh Direct's VP of Public Affairs. Larry is an alum of two administrations, the Bloomberg administration and the de Blasio administration, having held the position of Deputy Commissioner at the New York City Department of Parks and Chief of Staff at NYC Small Business Services. He has long been a leader in our community on issues including education, housing, and healthcare, and we are really proud to have him as a member of our ABNY Steering Committee. Thank you, Larry. And finally, before I pass the Zoom to Larry, let me say this series would not be possible without the leadership of our ABNY team. Melva Miller, Executive VP of ABNY, who conceptualized this entire structure of this series, and of Laura Calicruccio, the Acting Director of ABNY, who, working with Melva, helped us organize this program and all the important speakers we'll hear from in the weeks ahead. Thank you all. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Larry Scott Blackman, our public advocate.
Thank you, Stephen. And it is an honor and a pleasure to serve as the moderator of the first Black Leadership in New York City discussion. I would like to thank you. I would like to thank the staff at ABNY, Laura, Melva, and importantly, everyone who's joined us in the middle of an afternoon on a hot, humid day. It is all of you that do the work of the community. It is not the seed that decides what grows, it is the soil. and all of you represent the soil of New York, whether you're in business, nonprofit sector, government, private sector. You are the soil and the fabric of New York, and we are pleased to bring this to you today. So, Public Advocate Williams, we're going to dive right in. Thank you for joining us. You've been a prominent activist for some time now. You were a member of Community Board 18 in Brooklyn. I understand that you were active even in college. And you served in the City Council and Council District 45, and now you are in the Office of the Public Advocate. Can you speak to us about the evolution of politics, power, and racial justice from your grassroots perspective?
Well, first, it's an honor to have you as a moderator. I really appreciate that, brother, and I appreciate ABNY for putting this together, Stephen and Melva and everyone who conceptualized this and is creating this space. And I hope this space continues after we've moved forward in the city. It's important that we keep these kind of spaces going and learning from them and like really making them a part of how we govern and talk about issues. You know, I call myself an activist elected official. Personally, you know, this is a journey that I've always been on. I always tell folks when I was younger, my heroes were Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Spider-Man, X-Men, everything were kind of mixed into one. And social justice issues was always a big thing for me. You know, acting is my first love. I have Tourette's syndrome. When I'm on stage, when I'm really acting, my tics go away. It's a very zen place for me. But social justice was always an issue for me on Brooklyn College campus. You can blame them because I really trained on how to cause as much trouble as I could, the kind of good trouble. Then I got elected to city council. Everybody told me I was crazy for running. And I've been trying to cause as much trouble as I can in this city to really try to shift the way people are looking at this system. And as far as the evolution, it's interesting. The evolution for me was, it's more consistency of what I've been trying to do and what I've been trying to see, and to see the moment meeting what, not just me, but others, although we were very often one of a few really pushing narratives that can help get power from the select few, but really make sure that power is spread across a bunch of folks who need it because they are making life decisions with resources that they don't have. And so I've been consistent in trying to push that narrative from college to now. It's been interesting to see people who told us we were crazy are now adopting a lot of the words and, more importantly, the policies. And I hope it only continues. It's been interesting to see how people are responding to those in a time of crisis, the pandemic, with gun violence, and a host of other issues. You know, I think we'll talk about this more going forward, but it's, you know, I think at the beginning, you know, even before me, and I see this happen in a lot of different areas and people who don't see themselves in power, the first rung is usually like, how do I see myself represented in power? And so even the Black community, we got victories when we got people elected and they did some good work. I think what happened was at some point, many folks tried to replicate what they saw. So in essence, they're replicating some of the things that they had rallied against and railed against. And I think that's caused us some problems because unfortunately, a lot of times elected officials, incumbency protection has oftentimes trumped what's good, I believe, for the people we're representing. And so I've always tried to have the mantra of the people I represent is the most important. My seat is not more important than them. And I try my best to live my life as an elected official in decisions I make. Now, I'm only human, so I can't pretend that some of the other stuff doesn't get in. But when I'm finished, I just want to at least be in the Hall of Fame if possible. Maybe not perfect.
I can certainly understand that. Certainly understand that. You mentioned some of the challenges that you faced politically, some of the things that were said to you, and personally, you had to overcome many challenges just to, you know, play on a level playing field with others. You've talked rather candidly about some of your personal struggles with Tourette's, and you served as an inspiration, frankly, not just to African-American kids, but to any other, you know, child out there who looks to serve their community. How did you turn those barriers into opportunities, and how have those barriers shaped your work and your life today?
It's interesting. It's only now am I starting to come to grips with people kind of saying I've inspired them to do things. It's still not something I'm especially comfortable with, but I try my best to, if I am going to inspire some folks, try to be the best inspiration that I can be. I gave a speech, I believe it was when I lost the lieutenant governor's race, and it was very moving. Somebody came up to me, and I've talked about it, and told me that this person had Tourette's syndrome, and he didn't think he could be elected official until he saw me on the stage speaking, and that really hit me. And as you mentioned, it's not just Black people. This was a young white man. I think a lot of folks thought when I told the story that it wasn't. So it was just, it was amazing. It brought me back to times before where people have spoke to me about it. I remember it was a white gentleman who came to me in the middle of the stop, question, and frisk stuff, and he was saying his daughter had Tourette's, and she sees me and she has hope. And he said, I don't care what you talk about, because when my daughter sees it, she feels she can move forward. And I've been open about in my issues with mental health, and making sure I'm open about the therapy I've been getting for the past 4 years and how it's helped move me forward. And I think too often people look at us kind of robotic. And I want folks to understand, I'm a human being. I have human experiences, and we have to start talking about these things a lot more, so that we can show people who are also human that you're going to struggle, and it's okay, and you should ask for help when you can, and you should just move forward. I never looked at Tourette's syndrome or ADHD necessarily as barriers. That's probably in part because of my mom, who refused to let me, so it wasn't something I thought about so much. But even in therapy, I realized that I actually never had a chance to take a second and deal with it, which I think is important as well. So when I was diagnosed, next day you just keep moving. I got things, but you should always take some time and think about how it's impacting you, how it's affecting you. So I want to make sure folks do that as well. And it was me, it's just, my whole story has kind of been, difficult. High school, 4 years of high school, 3 summer schools, 2 night school, independent study. College took me 7 years to get my 4-year. Took me 4 years to get my 2-year. For me, it's always just been, just keep moving, just keep pedaling.
Amen. Don't quit.
Yeah.
Don't quit. I'd like to shift gears and move into this unprecedented moment in time. For some people, some of us have seen this before, but I'd like to talk a little bit about, where we are in terms of the call to action and the civil unrest and the protest and calls for action related to the murders of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and others. There's this theory, social amnesia, right? And you've talked about this collective amnesia, and I'd like you to kind of expand on that a little bit. But what feels different to you about this particular moment in time? Is there anything that feels different to you? And the second question I'd like to ask is, how do we keep the momentum behind this going? How do we turn this passion into true action? Can that be done legislatively, locally? I'd like to ask you those few questions.
That's a lot. That's an hour conversation right there. I believe most folks will say, although we've seen this kind of thing before, it does feel a little different and unique. Whether that leads to the kind of transformation or change that this country needs remains to be seen. I just want to make sure folks contextualize what happened. And so I keep reminding folks we are in the middle of a global pandemic. People had been locked up in their homes for 2-3 months. Right. While that's happening, people are seeing that the disproportionate impact on the Black and Brown community, seeing disproportionate death in these communities, disproportionate unemployment in these communities, irrefutable. It's right there. Seeing how police effectuate law enforcement, even with social distancing. One community, nothing, or they were handed masks. In another community, punched to the face, thrown to the ground. Those were kind of irrefutable. And then in that context, people saw Breonna Taylor. Then they saw a man on someone else's knee until he died. And so that's the context that we're in, which is a little different than we've seen before. Also, You know, we've often said, many people have discussion, what we need is someday for the people who feel the most privileged in this construct to raise their voices in a loud way. And we've seen that. I mean, as much as people have, you know, want to talk about what's going on in Portland and editorialize, the powerful scenes of groups, large groups of white neighbors and Americans screaming Black Lives Matter and standing up is a powerful scene to watch. And so it feels a little different. I felt like something was different when NASCAR said they were no longer going to fly the Confederate flag. That was like a cultural shift, which is what we need. And Aunt Jemima was no longer going to be that name. Those were things that were like, wait a minute, something might actually be happening. And, you know, I remind folks, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. It was a great moment. We didn't see the impact that we thought we would from those days. And now we have to be clear about the forward movement that has come. But what's happening now again is the country is once again on the cusp of reckoning and maybe atoning for what it means to have enslaved an entire race of people, and what that impact will have and ripple effect will have 401 years later. We have never fully atoned for that. We have never fully reckoned with it. And that is the critical point, that if we miss that, you know, we're going to waste all of this that we're going through right now. And some of that is legislatively. We have to have some legislative change, but we have to have some cultural change. We have to have some resource change. We have to have people finally to understand that there is a system of privilege that exists in this country. It just is. And we have to get past the notion that everybody has to be a racist or a bigot in that system. No, you don't have to be a racist. You don't have to be a bigot to take part in a privileged system. You might be, by the way. I never want to take that off the menu. It's possible. But you don't have to be. And you are also not responsible. You, me, Steve, Melvin, no one is responsible for that system that came before us. But all of us are responsible for the system that we give to the next generation. And if we can grapple with that in a real way, then we'll see the type of changes that we hope to see and that we need to see for this country to line up with what it says it is versus what it's doing. If we didn't have this president, we may be able to go through that conversation a little easier, but it becomes even worse when you literally have someone who probably has a hood in his closet, overseeing this country at this time.
You know, oftentimes to deal with sensitive topics or problems in a community, elected officials turn to a task force or a committee or a commission to deal with it. Oftentimes with people they're comfortable with, and that's not to slight anyone on a committee, but you sort of see that task force and you say, okay, what's really going to come out of that? And so my question for you is, are these types of entities even useful? How do we push past this? Are they helpful? How do we empower that type of committee in the group setting to really make change? There are dozens of individuals, as you know, coming from the grassroots nature where you started, who do real community substantive work, who will never be seen on those task forces and those committees. Nevertheless, those entities are there. Are they useful? How can we push those things to enact real change?
Well, I've started a task force to discuss now. I'm just going.
A committee to discuss a committee.
I want to say that some of my, I believe, greatest impacts have come through task force and can be used correctly. Now, a lot of people know the work I've done around, trying to mitigate the abuses of stop, question, and frisk. What I'm most proud of is the work that we've done around gun violence, and hopefully we get to that soon, right. Which up until the pandemic was actually working and doing great in the city. And that work we did around, which most folks call now the Cure Violence or send to the crisis management system. We got the first 5 pilot programs created. That actually came from a task force. The work we did around going from 25, 30,000 summer youth jobs to 75,000 summer youth jobs and trying to get to 100,000, because we know the number one way to cut violent crime arrests in half of young people is a job. That also came through a task force. But the task force has to be temporal, has to be a very set time, and the charge has to be very clear. And then it has to be sure at that time period, what are the things that we're going to do now? The problem is that's not usually what happens. It's not temporal. The charge isn't very clear. It's kind of amorphous, and it doesn't have a time set. And some of these questions we already know the answers to. People are just afraid to go forward with what we know needs to be done. We don't need a task force right now to address some of the issues that Black Lives Matter has brought up. We now need to go into implementation stage. And what's happened is that people don't want to implement the change that needs to happen. And so when people are talking about the NYPD and reshaping public safety, and people get lost in this word defund NYPD, doesn't trouble me, whether it's defund, divest, reinvest. We should talk about what it means. We should talk about what public safety means and law enforcement's role in that. We don't have the courage to have that discussion. When we want to make sure that people understand, if we can't hire doctors, if we can't hire nurses, if we can't hire guidance counselors, if we can't hire social workers, if we tell the people of Flatbush that you can't have your gynecological oncology department, we have to shut it down, even though Black women's maternal mortality rate is really high. We don't have money for any of that, but one thing we have money for is additional police officers, that there's a problem there. Then we have an issue. And so if the task force is so that we won't do these things, then obviously it's problematic. What we need is to have the courage to just move forward. And unfortunately, the mayor has not moved forward the way we should have, and the governor hasn't. Even to the impact now where we're trying to say, don't cut Medicaid. Just review and look at these revenue raising options that we had. The governor just today said, we know the federal government has to give us stimulus package. We know that, or it's going to be really bad. But we're saying is just look at every option. And the governor's saying we're going to have to raise fares, raise this, raise that, because the money has to come from somewhere. It just never has to come from the people who actually have the most expendable income. And so what we're saying is all of us just have to share in this space where we're saying we can't ask people to continually pay for more when they don't have it. We have seniors who are trying to choose between rent and medication. And there are people who actually can pay a little bit more, and we should bring them into the conversation. Don't leave them out, millionaires, billionaires, don't leave them, bring them into the conversation. Let's say, let's all have some collective responsibility at this moment in time. And so the answer is twofold. Yes, task force can be beneficial, but not when they're being used to talk about things that we've talked to death. And now it is about implementation, and we need to have the political courage to implement those things.
That's actually a question. One of the questions that came up that the audience wanted to know was, specifically what were your thoughts related to the federal government, and if there isn't financial assistance coming to the city or to the state, how should the state and the city address that? What are some means to mitigate the lack of federal funding and the impact that would have on New Yorkers, and your thoughts on that? I know you just touched on it, but if there are any other quick points that you wanted to just make sure you hammered home on that, I welcome that at this time.
I mean, it's terrible. We are in bad shape. I don't want to mince words about that. The federal government needs to come through. This president is horrific. So I don't know that that's going to happen. And these sheeple Republican leaders, I don't know if they're going to help with that. And so we have to be clear about how bad the situation may be, but we have some things that we can do. And, I know the audience that I'm speaking to, but, I try to be consistent in whoever I'm speaking to. One of the things that we have to do is the governor has to entertain revenue raising options, period. Even if there's going to be cuts, which there might be, there's going to have to be, but we have to explore every option that we have. And one of those is revenue raising option. One of those is looking at the stock transfer tax. One of those is looking at a true millionaire billionaires tax. One of those is looking at the peer-to-peer tax. We just have to do that. If we're going to entertain cutting the bone, then we have to entertain the revenue raising options. The state also has to allow the city to borrow the way it did in 9/11. The mayor is right on this. I know the messenger is not the best because people are having issues with the mayor, but he's correct. And we don't need strict financial control board things like we did in the 70s. This is different. This is not because of fiscal mismanagement. This is because of a global pandemic. So yes, there has to be some constraints. We have to make sure that nothing happens that's irresponsible, but we can't make it so strict that the city can't move. And lastly, it just has to be equitable. And so many people are complaining about the defunding of NYPD. And I keep telling folks, actually, the NYPD wasn't defunded. We didn't even come close to $1 billion. Other agencies were defunded much more than the police department.
I'm going to come back to that, public advocate. I'm going to come back to that.
All right, some youth jobs were decimated. And so all we're saying is that we have to have an equitable, if we're not going to hire, then we're not going to hire. If we unfortunately have to fire, then we have to do it across the board. We can't have one group like the NYPD being sacrosanct. And we have to understand the impact that cutting over half of summer youth jobs is going to have on public safety. And so those are some of the things that we can do and that we have to do right now. We actually put out a report, and people can check it out on my website, of how to get through the pandemic. And we also renamed it Structural Inequity. And some of that talks about the revenue raising ideas that we have, and people can go to the website, advocate.nyc.gov, and take a look, and we welcome any feedback as well.
Fantastic. So along the lines of regarding the NYPD, you know, you've been out there working with community groups and other activists on ways to reform, reimagine, re-engage the NYPD, and also on topics of public safety. What are you hearing from the ground? What are you hearing from grassroots organizations about, you know, ways that the divide between the NYPD and the community can be bridged?
Well, people are getting lost on nomenclature way too often. So people hear defund NYPD and some folks shut down. It's unfortunate. And I just want to be clear what this bridge is about. And so we can have as many good policing programs or community programs, which I support, neighborhood policing, which is different than community policing. If we have time, we can get into it. But I support that. I support all of those things, which are great. But if you don't get to accountability and transparency and reframing of this discussion about public safety, then you won't get what you want. So you can do all the great community work, but if you don't get to those real buckets, it's going to be hard to bridge that divide. And we keep wanting to bridge it without doing the hard work. And I always tell folks, you know, and I'll take this gun violence spike as an example because we cannot ignore it. None of us can ignore it. I went to the wake of a 1-year-old child who was shot and killed. That's unacceptable, and the entire city should freeze until we figure it out. And if we take that as a model, and anyone who says that law enforcement has no role to play here, they are just wrong. Anyone who says that law enforcement has the only role or an outsized role, they are also wrong. And we really have to begin to see and look at what public safety is or is it. And now, as I mentioned briefly, we had some things that were working around gun violence pre-pandemic. Gun violence and other crimes and violence was at an all-time low, probably unsustainable low. Then we got hit with a pandemic. Post-pandemic, everything in these communities have gotten worse. Housing and homelessness has gotten worse. Trying to get education on a daily basis has gotten worse. Access to healthy foods, food scarcity is worse. Domestic violence has gotten worse. Why did we think gun violence would not get worse, particularly as we moved into the summer months? It's crazy to me that we didn't begin to plan this. And what many of us are saying is, again, how can you not hire any of the other things that we say are needed? But the one thing the city has money for is 1,000 additional new police officers. If we could throw police at these problems and it would solve completely, then it would have been solved already. And so what we are saying is that we have to stop equating police with public safety. and start understanding that police are a part of public safety. But where are the other measures that are needed for a community to feel and be safe? Because the communities that have access to safe, affordable housing, that have access to quality education, have jobs that can pay the money, can have pay the bills, and can have access to quality food that hopefully is nearby and accessible, and have access to quality healthcare and mental health services. Public safety looks a lot different in those communities. And we have to stop telling communities that they can't ask for better policing and safer streets at the exact same time. The fact of the matter is, I've been to funerals with civilian on civilians have killed each other, officers on civilians have killed, and civilians on officers. And the death looks the same, and the pain is the same. And these communities are dealing with trauma on every level. And we keep telling them, well, you have to choose which trauma you address. And they're like, no, we want to address both traumas. And very often people will come up and say, well, these communities are saying they want additional police services. They want these services. And then I always push back, they probably do, but I want you to ask them if they would like their gynecological oncology department to stay open, if they would like to have access to the resources they need so they can get the quality education, basic things like broadband. That I would like you to ask them whether or not they'd like to have safe, affordable housing. Would they like to have the healthcare that they want as well, as they need as well? The answer will be yes to all of those things. But for some reason, we don't talk about the rest of those questions that are being asked, that are being answered. We just stick to one thing. And that one thing, if we only focus on it, makes it worse. And so if we went to, if we were sick and we went to the hospital, but we only stayed in triage, that's the only thing they let us stay in. We never get to the back of the room where the doctors and the interdisciplinary discussions are going on, all the machines, then we won't get well. And we keep trying to solve a complex problem with an acute solution. We have to stop doing that. And I want to be clear, this is not an excuse. You do not get excused by taking out a gun and shooting someone and killing a child and killing a grandmother and killing high school graduates who are going on to college. That is not an excuse. But we have to address the root problems or we will keep being here. And this is happening across the nation. So it's not just a defund NYPD conversation. We have to deal with the supply of guns, because we have a demonic obsession with guns. There is no illegal guns. All illegal guns were legal at some point. So Congress has to act. On a city and state level, we have to address the demand for violence. And we know what works. We just have to fund it. And so if you have a $6 billion entity, that doesn't count the foundation funding money that it gets. But you have these groups that we work with that are at about 40 or 50 million. It's a huge imbalance. And it's a disservice to send people who only have the tools of a gun, handcuffs, baton, and summonses and ask them to solve everything. It's unfair to the community and unfair to the men and women in blue who go to work every day trying to make things better.
I want to dive into about 3 or 4 other questions, because I know we're coming up on time and we do want to have some Q&A from the audience. And this is—
My bad, I talk a lot.
That's all right. That's all right. I'm sure you remember a television show on Channel 7 hosted by Gil Noble. Do you remember that show?
I was forced to watch Like It Is. I didn't want to at the time, and I'm very glad my mother made me.
So I appreciate you for telling it like it is right now. We're going to dive into that, because when we announced this series, that, you know, we know a lot of the same people, and some people push me on certain things, and I want to make sure that we touch on this. So, you know, there are Black New Yorkers, right? And the role of the public advocate is to advocate for all New Yorkers in that position, right? And many who are engaged on the grassroots level, working in the community, working with police, who do not support the defund the police movement. So how do Black leaders in New York City balance their ideological core beliefs with the will of others in the Black community who are all working on the same issue, stopping violence? And I want to come back to that in a second, but I wanted to ask you to address that, because there's a certain knee-jerk politics that takes place that the silent people who work in the community are not able to say, hey, we disagree. And people do disagree with that. So I wanted you to touch on that.
Well, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, I said people getting lost in nomenclature. I would submit that there's less disagreement than people think. There are some people who are just saying defund everything, but most of folks are not saying that. when they say, if I said and had those conversations with those very same people, and I said we need to reinvest and we need to reimagine what public safety is, and we have to reimagine where the funding and our money goes, I guarantee you we would agree on that conversation. It's the overlay of people in the police that people are starting to get lost on. And the biggest problem I have with this budget season is we lost the opportunity to have a discussion. If I spoke with those same folks and I said, well, why is the police department responding, the first responders to mental health calls when people need medical assistance? They would probably agree with me. Right there's money that we could take from the police department and put it into health services, and they can call the police if it's needed. If I said to them, well, let's look at the resources that we actually have. Why are police going to traffic accidents and filling out paperwork? Why are they holding up barriers at parades? Is that what we really need them to do? Maybe we can reassess those resources and we don't need 1,000 extra police. If I said to them, do you want 40,000 more summer youth jobs that we just got cut? They would say, yes. Yeah. So I think what it is people are forced into these corners that are not real. And we have to have someone that has the bold passion to force these conversations, because what people are start to do is look at the politics of it. Where do I need support? What can I, and that's dangerous. And that gets people harmed. And that's what happened.
I want to jump in, and I apologize only because I know we're going to approach about 10 minutes remaining in the conversation very soon. But there's two other questions I want to jump into that are related to this. I've marched several times, more than several, and you have as well. And a question that has come up to me recently, you mentioned the uptick in crime, and we all can agree on what some of the issues are that cause that, right? You keep people indoors and, they don't have anything to do, and there's certain causes to that. But, as a Black man, when there is Black on Black crime, the question that has been posed to me is, where's the outrage? We don't see Black leaders in our community as much marching, fighting when there's Black on Black crime. But if a police officer commits something, then we see everyone out. We see we see the protests, we see the rallies, we see the Occupy. Where is that level of dedication? I know it's there. Let me just say this. I know it's there because if you're in the community, you see the work every day. But I just want you to address that question that comes up from some people who criticize the work or criticize certain movements as it relates to police action.
And I appreciate that question. I do want to reframe it, because the terminology Black on Black crime is usually just to try to not answer questions that people are asking about police violence. And I don't want to subscribe to that. So I want to talk about crime. There's no white on white crime. There's no Asian on Asian crime. There's crime. And if the question is, what are we doing about crime in the Black community? That is a valid question to be asking. I also want to put context on it, because the questions of accountability and transparency are important, and people should not lose that context. What should happen is that when people commit crimes, there's accountability. So there's a likelihood that someone might get arrested if there's a civilian on civilian crime. But the problem is that state sanctioned people who are paid to protect people who are paid to do a job commit violence and homicide on people, and then there is no accountability. So that's two different sets of context, and we have to be very clear about that. So when people get infuriated because this person is paid to harm, to protect, and they're harming, there's no accountability and there's no transparency. That is a standalone conversation that people should be allowed to have. When it comes to crime in the Black community, nobody wants to see that happen. And as you mentioned, that work is being done time and time again. But this country has a demonic obsession with violence. And so the same question could be asked, where is Congress when we are selling guns all over the place, right, when children are being mowed down with machine guns? And so that is a very real question, but it's not a question that you necessarily need to ask the people who are asking about a very specific type of violence. It's a thing we have to ask the country. But I too want to see the entire city at the wake of a 1-year-old child who was shot and killed. But I don't know that you should say because that hasn't happened, we should no longer talk about police violence or people are being paid to do one thing and something else is happening. But we do have to push it. I sincerely agree with that. And we have to have those victims of crime and the victims and their families, they deserve more than rhetoric. And no one can sit here and tell me if we simply send more police, we will solve the gun violence problem and there will be no more shootings. That's a lie. And people who are losing their loved ones deserve us to have an honest conversation about what we need to do to deal with this issue.
Thank you. And I appreciate this portion of the conversation because some of these conversations are uncomfortable and they should be uncomfortable. These are the conversations that New York City's leaders need to have, and we appreciate you for doing that. I'm going to pivot a little bit into the last question before we go to the audience with the time that we have left. And the Association for a Better New York is one of New York City's leading organizations focused on the continued growth of New York's people, community, and business. Comprised of, I don't need to tell you, but I'll tell everyone else, corporations, nonprofits, educational institutions, health institutions, unions, you name it. So what does ABNY need to do to continue to be a part of the conversation? What should business do to combat inequality?
So one, I do want to say, if you are still comfortable in July of 2020, you're not doing enough. You are simply not doing enough. And we all need to be pushing forward to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable at a time like this. And that's what we have to do. So you're right, we have to have these uncomfortable conversations on a continual basis. In terms of what ABNY and everyone should be doing, I always say do what you can with what you have where you are. This space is a great space and these discussions are great. And I'll be remiss if I didn't say, these type of conversations we could have had before, right? And so
right.
A lot of these things, like with the bills that just passed, we were in a situation where we had to thank leaders who were blocking the bills in the first place. And so people keep saying these are new conversations, and they're absolutely not. The only reason those bills were ready to go is because people have been working on them for such a long time. And so what I tell organizations is, these conversations are important. But one, have an honest reflection on yourself. Who are the top 5, 6 people that you go to and listen to about decisions that need to be made? Not the people that are out there that look like they are the decision makers, but who are the real decision makers in those organizations? And do they have a real voice? Are they reflective of what the city looks for? Are there intentional ways that you are trying to deal with a privileged system that affects communities very badly? What is the intentional way that we are trying to lift Black businesses in ABNY who are historically don't have access to the capital that they need, but are actually the most likely to hire the young people who are likely to get into trouble if they don't have ways to harness their youthful energy that everybody has. When you have that youthful energy and you have access to a cow, you might tip that cow, right? If you have access to a gun, you might shoot that gun. And so ABNY has to look at itself and say, what are we intentionally doing? What are the pipelines that we're moving in the way? How are we making sure that our businesses that do not have access either to the capital, to the attorneys, to the lessons that they need to learn to move forward? What is ABNY and what are folks doing to bridge that divide? And so it's intentionality that needs to happen, because I am a cisgendered male, so I have privilege. And I have to learn that the folks around me, if I don't intentionally try to mix it up, intentionally try to pull in voices that are not heard in a real way, then it won't happen. And that too is uncomfortable, but we have to do it and we have to be okay. And we have to allow people to make mistakes and ask questions that are also uncomfortable, because we have to assume that we don't know everybody's journey, how they got to where they are, and they simply don't know. And if we kind of jump on everybody every time they say something that they may not be aware of, or every time they ask a question, then we're not going to learn. So we have to create that space as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, my brother. And we are going to move into the Q&A portion, and I'm going to start off. We have about 10 minutes remaining. I'm going to start off with this question. So pardon me, everyone, if I'm not looking at you, I'm reading. So we're going to go right into it. The first question we're going to ask you, Brother Public Advocate, is we understand the system is broken and various institutions need to revalue how they allocate resources and how people of color are treated by law enforcement institutions. However, what do you think is the responsibility of communities of color to move forward?
I would say we have a great responsibility. There's no way around it. And so we keep thinking these conversations are separate, but they're intersecting. And so it's not a choice. The personal accountability discussion goes along with the structural inequity conversation. And so we have to have the conversation about, okay, parents, how are you doing this? How are you not doing this? We have to have the conversation about young people, you're responsible for your own actions, and there has to be accountability attached to it. But it is immoral to have that conversation without then exploring the structural inequity that is pushing people to make decisions based on what's around them. Like, we know what works. And I always remind folks, decades ago, when the immigrants were from Europe and their skin was a little lighter, this kind of violence and these problems were occurring. They were shooting each other and stabbing each other, and there were gangs fighting. They were shooting and police. And the social elite at that time said, we need to have upward mobility programs for education and jobs. The biggest expansion of CUNY happened during the Great Depression. When the violence got a little darker and they became more melanated, at that time we said, these animals are victims of their own self-destruction. And if anything was sent, it was law enforcement. So we know what works. But we have to understand that there's a system in place, and we need to show folks what that system is and allow them to make better decisions. But we have a moral obligation to try to not reform the system, but put an entirely new system down. So I'm with it, and I'm with personal responsibility, but these are intersecting conversations, not separate ones. And I always remind folks, there is something called false consciousness. And as when something happens to a community so long, sometimes they believe that that is a status and state that they are supposed to be. And we have to work past that as well.
All right, so Public Advocate Williams, we're going to go into our version of speed dating. So we're going to move through these questions quickly. So I need you to give me the, Family Feud condensed answers. All right, here we go. Survey said, here we go. Here's a question. I've been lucky enough to be a Black professional in the private sector over the course of my career, but I worry for my younger brothers and sisters trying to get into the corporate sector careers that we know have the best chance of providing a middle-class experience in New York. Public Advocate Williams, what pressure do you think can be brought to bear on the many companies, firms, et cetera, that do business in New York, but have woeful outcomes for hiring and retaining Black college graduates?
Well, we have to be honest about this. And the problem is there's no honesty in the discussions. And so when we look at contracts that are going to companies, when we look at Hudson Yards, for example, which was terrible. And I know the company I'm in right now, but Hudson Yards was terrible in the amount of tax breaks that it got versus who it's actually serving right now. And everybody who looks at that critically knows that. So we have to have the political will to say you are not going to do business in New York City unless you are helping the least among us. Before the pandemic, New York City was doing great, except for a subset of the population. And again, we have to intentionally go in there and make the changes. I always want to say, and I have to say this, we don't have to change a broken system. The system is working how it was laid out to work. And that is what the crux of where we are in 2020. And if the quote unquote founding fathers woke up today and had a conversation, they would say, look, I'm not sure why you had a Black president. I'm not sure why women are voting, but otherwise pretty good job of continuing what it was that we started. A house that needs a repainting is different than a house that has a foundational crack in it. And what we first have to do is be honest about that foundational crack and say that we are going to address that. These are not excuses, right? Because everybody needs to work hard. But at the same time, we should at least be honest in the system that we're in so we can work to make it truly equitable and with justice and equality in it.
And just to piggyback off of that really quick, something you said, hiring a person of color because they are a person of color is great, but not empowering them or hiring them just to work around them, totally defeats the purpose of empowerment of that individual, which is really what we need to have in some of these sectors, these private sector conversations. Another quick question, can you talk about the connection between mental health and policy? People talk about the latest surge in gun violence. Is it the act of the individuals or systems? How and where can mental health policy help, if at all?
Mental health is huge. You speak to people who are dealing with trauma on a regular basis, and hurt people. You go to communities that have the resources they need, and something happens in their school, the school provides trauma support, or that family can get support for that trauma that happened. You go to communities that are dealing with gun violence on a regular basis, that school opens up the next day, everybody goes to school. That family doesn't have access to mental health. I've been clear about what my access to therapy has done in my personal life. I know I had issues. I'm now engaged, and I'm awesome. So happy about that. New stepdad. None of that would have been capable, I don't believe, without having access to the services I need. We have to be able, we have to be able to talk about mental health. By the way, mental health and mental illness are two separate things. Mental illness shouldn't be ashamed to get the assistance you need. We all need to have a mental health check-in. And so we have to be able to have a conversation where you say, I'm having my mental health check-in, just like you say, my stomach hurts, I'm about to take some Pepto-Bismol. And until we get to that point, it's going to be difficult for folks to have that conversation, especially in the communities who need it the most. Black communities, Caribbean communities, immigrant communities. They're ashamed to have these conversations, and we have to break down those stigmas.
Thank you. And we'll have the final question. And before I turn it back over to Stephen to close us out, how are you creating space for new Black leaders in city government?
You know, I try my best to figure out who I'm supported by, who is going to be bold in speaking truth to power, and what voices are missing and not heard enough. And then that's how I try to do it. And in this country, to be honest, the further you are from being a wealthy, cisgendered white male, the further you are probably as a community from the things you need to make your life happy. And so it's not a surprise to me that Black transgendered women are suffering the way they are in every data point that you look at. And so again, we have to intentionally make sure we're empowering these communities. So I try my best to surround myself and give voice to people who are suffering in this system. And again, you know, I want to remind people, everybody, and this is where everybody can grab it. Nobody was around when slavery happened. Of course, slavery is still legal in prison. That's a whole nother conversation, but nobody was around for that. And we are not responsible for that system, but we all have a part to play. And we just all need to play our part so that we can change the system for our children and their children. And I think that's a space where everybody can grab it, Black, white, brown. But we just have to be able to have a discussion that is honest about what the system is predicated on and where we are as a society and how we move forward.
Thank you. And with that, Public Advocate Williams, I want to say thank you for the opportunity. I am pleased to call you a friend, a brother, a mentor, and an advocate, an advocate's advocate. So thank you for the time. I'd like to personally thank ABNY, and I'm going to turn this over to Steve.
Well, I appreciate you, Steve, and everyone. Stephen, thank you so much. I feel like we spent a lot of time around PD things, so I'd love to come back. I know there's a whole host of other issues that we could have reached, so I'll come back one day and talk about some of those things.
Well, thank you. We would love to take you up on that, and we would love to have you back. Let me say thank you to both of you. First, Larry, for really leading this awesome and important conversation for us today. I couldn't think of really a better way for us to get started, and the depth of this conversation. To Jumaane, our public advocate, we are so grateful for your leadership. I know I am leaving this Zoom with a deeper understanding of issues I did not understand as well at the beginning of this. And I think talking about getting past the nomenclature to find a path and a bridge towards each other, not letting that nomenclature get in the way of real solutions with each other is really important. I want to thank you. I'm grateful for that. Our community is grateful for that. And we look forward to working with you more and having you back. I'll say 3 fast things to end. 1, please, as an ABNY call, say, please fill out your census. It is important. We are behind, and The communities need us to fill out your census. It takes 10 minutes. I know it is a pain, but please, it will benefit us in a real way. Second, please join us again. This is the first of many, and we're back again next week. And then the last thing I'd say is please come to us in ways we can work together and ideas you've had off of the things that the public advocate has said to us, because take it to heart when he says we weren't in this conversation deep enough and early enough, but we intend not to have that be the case in the future. So I want to say thank you, everybody. Most of all, thank you to Larry and to our great public advocate. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Peace and blessings.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you. Take care, guys.